Thursday, of course, is Thanksgiving, and I sort of feel sorry for Thanksgiving today because it gets short shrift. Christmas had become so commercialized that stores start putting out Christmas stuff before Labor Day, and people may have a Thanksgiving meal at their house, but in general, it's all about Christmas now, and Thanksgiving gets more and more lost. But I always like Thanksgiving. There's not one single source that forms our tradition of Thanksgiving. There are several that all sort of came together to form that. And I thought it would be interesting to spend a few minutes thinking about that today. Thanksgiving is a fall festival. It has overtones of harvest festival. Our societies of the past traditionally had harvest festivals in the fall where they celebrated the harvest for that year. And that was back when famines occurred regularly. A drought might come, insects, a heat wave, some other problem, and you had a poor harvest, and that meant that people might not have enough food for winter. That was back before they had food storage, no refrigeration. There was no such thing as shipping food from California to North Carolina. It was back before food could be transported and stored, and civilization sometimes hung by a thread. One bad year could wipe out a lot of people. So people were thankful for a good harvest because it meant you could make it through winter. And they were always nervous about whether they were going to have that, and so if it was good, and they were able to put a lot of food back for winter, that was cause to celebrate. And these harvest festivals often had religious connotations because of the belief that the spiritual beings or the gods had a lot to do with whether or not you had a good harvest. If the gods were pleased with you, they would smile on you and you'd have a good harvest. That was cause to thank them. Of course, it wasn't a completely selfless thing, because the idea was that if you thanked them and showed appreciation this year, they'd be more likely to give you a good harvest next year. So having a harvest festival is sort of like an investment. Give thanks, make the gods happy this year, and maybe they'll keep smiling on us for next year. So that's one source of our Thanksgiving. That same mindset basically is what's behind another source, and this one is connected with the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims were Puritans, and Puritans were a religious group in England, and they were Calvinists. Now, Calvinists, just like all religious groups, had fractured off into numerous different groups that didn't like each other, didn't believe the same thing, didn't want anything to do with each other. And so the Pilgrims came here so they could just be alone and do as they pleased and not be bothered by people who did not share their beliefs. Now, many of the Calvinists did share some beliefs, though, and one of them was the belief that they should not celebrate religious holidays. They thought the only religious day was Sunday, and the only thing you should do on Sunday was have a regular church service. They didn't believe in observing any special days in church. And that meant, among other things, that they didn't celebrate Christmas. But Puritans did have two kinds of special observances out in society. One of those was days of fasting. Another was days of feasting. And remember, we've talked about Calvinists enough in here to know that they believe God controls everything, absolutely everything. And that God uses that control to give good things to people who please Him and bad things to people who don't. And though if something happened bad for your society, that meant that your society had done bad. And remember, God balances the scales and gets even and pays you tit for tat. So that's where the days of fasting came from. Maybe there had been a bad storm, or a drought, or an outbreak of some kind of disease. And people would take that as a sign they had sinned, and days of fasting were proclaimed, usually for 3 days. They were supposed to think about all the ways they had sinned and determine to turn from that. And hopefully that would placate God, and God would take away the bad things. But on the other hand, if good things good crops, and good harvest, then it must be that God was rewarding you for being good. Because remember, God sends good things only on those people who please Him. So if things went well for you this year, you must have been doing good. So they would engage in 3 days of feasting. They would eat a lot, engage in recreation, and even engage in excess drinking. Now, although these had religious overtones to them, they were not church things. They were done in society. And that's where the first Thanksgiving came from that we are told was held in 1621. Now, lots of other groups of Calvinists would eventually come here. In fact, most all of the settlers from England that came here were Calvinists of one stripe or another. And all these people had days of fasting and days of Thanksgiving. There apparently were others, and some historians tell us there were others beforehand. Some historians tell us there was one in Maine in the year 1607, one in Jamestown in 1610. So the one the Pilgrims had may or may not have been the first. It was just the one that we remember. And it is reported that they themselves had a bigger one in 1623. But these days of Thanksgiving were held sporadically in many different places over the years by different colonists whenever they thought God had shown them a special favor. So that's another origin of our Thanksgiving. And there's yet another one. In the year 1788, the United States Constitution was ratified by the last state. And the next year, Congress approved a resolution that called for a day of Thanksgiving for the Constitution. And President George Washington set that for November the 26th, 1789. It was on a Thursday. It was specifically for that one day, 1 year, Thanksgiving for the Constitution. But that sort of set a precedent where after that various presidents would proclaim days of Thanksgiving for different things. In 1863, after the Union forces were victorious at the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving on the 4th Thursday of November of every year to celebrate the victory at Gettysburg. Now that eventually morphed into a general day of Thanksgiving. In the late 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt tried to change it to the 3rd Thursday, but people got so upset about it that Congress passed a law in 1941 to fix the date of Thanksgiving as the 4th Thursday in November, and it is to be a day of general Thanksgiving. So all those threads coming together is how we got the holiday of Thanksgiving. Most churches who observe Thanksgiving Sunday do it the Sunday before Thanksgiving, because usually the Sunday after Thanksgiving is the first Sunday of Advent, and that is the case this year. If Thanksgiving falls really early in the month, sometimes you'll have an extra Sunday in there, but usually the first Sunday of Advent is the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Now, the Sunday before Thanksgiving usually does double duty. In Protestant and Roman Catholic churches, it's when Thanksgiving is celebrated, but it's also what is called Christ the King Sunday. And Christ the King Sunday is the last Sunday of the church liturgical year. And that's today. Next Sunday will be the first Sunday of Advent. And remember, Advent begins the new year of the church calendar. And so today is the last Sunday of this calendar year in the liturgical sense, and it is Christ the King Sunday. Now, the Roman Catholic Pope first proclaimed the last Sunday in November as Christ the King Sunday in 1925. The last Sunday of the church year, excuse me. So this is the 100th anniversary of Christ the King Sunday. Now, if you look at the liturgical calendar, you know, it starts in Advent. That is the time when we think about the things that happened before the birth of Jesus. Then we celebrate Christmas. Then we celebrate Epiphany, when the Magi go to see the baby Jesus. Then we celebrate the baptism of Jesus. Then we celebrate Lent. Then we celebrate Holy Week, which is Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. It's a crucifixion. And then we celebrate Easter, which is the resurrection. And then we celebrate the ascension of Jesus when he bodily ascended into heaven. And there's one other thing lacking that people used to not celebrate about Jesus in there, and that was the second coming. And so in 1925, they put Christ the King Sunday in Roman Catholic churches, and many Protestant churches also picked that up. And the Pope did that. One reason, he was concerned about the secularization of society, and he wanted to remind people that our King is Jesus, that we are to follow not society, but we are to follow Jesus because he is our King. So Christ the King Sunday is a day to remember Jesus' promise that he will come again, and this time in power and glory. That's in Protestant and Roman Catholic Christianity. Orthodox Christianity, though, does not observe Christ the King Sunday today. They have a somewhat different interpretation of that, and that's what they observe on what most of us know as Palm Sunday. Remember, that was the day Jesus entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey, and a throng of people came out to greet him. Jesus did not enter Jerusalem proudly as a king. He entered humbly, riding on a donkey, and that was his choice. We know it was his choice because we see in the Gospels where he told the disciples to go get the donkey. So Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem humbly on a donkey, and a few days later the Jewish leaders dragged Jesus to Pilate and told Pilate Jesus thought he was a king, and he was trying to be king. So Pilate needed to get rid of him. The Jewish leaders, of course, did that because they were jealous of Jesus because he drew large crowds, and also because he was teaching differently than they did. He was teaching things that went against their religion. So they dragged Jesus in front of Pilate and told him, this man thinks he's a king. And Pilate asked Jesus, is he a king? And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this universe. Jesus said, for this cause I was born, and this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Now Jesus, of course, knew where being witness to the truth would lead. He knew he would be killed. He explicitly said that. He told the disciples he would be killed. In John chapter 3, Jesus said, this is the judgment, that the light came into the world. Men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. Jesus was the king who came on a donkey, who was killed because he spoke the truth to those who were doing evil. They were exposed. Jesus was killed because he exposed the evilness of the Jewish leaders. But you know, the big thing in there is that the Jewish leaders never considered themselves to be evil. They considered themselves to be followers of God. In fact, they considered themselves to be the only true people of God in the whole world. So you can imagine how they felt when Jesus came along criticizing them and opposing things they taught. You see, they believed they were God's only people in the world. Only people God cared about in the world. And Jesus criticizes them and teaches things that go against what they teach. Naturally, they thought he was an enemy of God. We see in the scriptures where they say to Jesus, you're possessed by a demon. They thought he was possessed by a demon. So since they thought he was an enemy of God and possessed by a demon, they felt completely justified in killing him. In fact, they were doing God's work by killing Jesus. Jesus was going against God, and they were on God's side. You see, they never realized they were tools of Satan, that they had been deceived themselves. And that's why evil is so insidious. It operates through people who have no idea they are tools of evil. It operates through people who are convinced that they are doing right. When someone opposes them, they genuinely believe that it's their opposition that's doing evil. And that's what so many people don't understand today. When they look for evil, they look for things that are actively and consciously evil. But that's not what to look for. We need to look for those who have been deceived to the point where they don't realize they're cooperating with evil. People who are so deceived that when someone comes and stands for the good, they believe they themselves are evil. You see, that's how our world works. We see it in our society. We see it in our politics, in our government. We see it throughout the world. And that's why it's so hard for Christians to live in the world. You see, the problem living in the world as a Christian is not that there are all these people in control that are trying to do evil. The problem is that these people that are in control are doing evil, but they have been deceived into believing they are doing good. So what did Jesus say? He said, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. Standing up against evil will always get you in trouble, and that's what got Jesus in trouble. And it was simply because the people who were doing evil had no idea that they were deceived. They were deceived into thinking they were following good, that they were following God. And so when someone stood for good, they did the right thing, God's work, and killed him. The Bible talks about the world being in darkness. The world has been deceived into believing evil is good. Evil disguises itself as good. It does not appear bad. That's why the world opposes those who stand for the good. The world is not able to recognize good. Those who stand for the good will be opposed. The world has been deceived into believing lies are true. That's why the ones speaking truth suffer. The world will shout down those who speak truth, because those who have been deceived into believing lies think truth is a lie. Those who speak truth will pay a price. Jesus set the example for us, the example of suffering. Jesus paid the price for standing for good in a world deceived into believing good is bad and lies are true. Jesus paid the price for being a light shining in the darkness. You know, the first time Jesus came, he came as Christ the King, but he did not come as a triumphant king. He came as a king who suffers. And he came as a king who tells us that if we follow him, we will have to suffer also. The book of 1 Peter said, Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you as though something strange happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory of God rests upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified. Since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. If we live for the will of God, we will have to suffer. And the world won't like us. We won't be like everyone else. We'll be going a different way. And there's a price to pay for going a different way. You see, we are called to follow along behind Jesus. And that pathway leads to the cross. It does lead to the resurrection and the empty tomb. But the path to the resurrection is through the cross. Before the victory came suffering. We will win the victory, yes. But first we have to suffer. That's why Jesus told us to take up our cross and follow him. The path to the resurrection leads through the cross. So that's the way Orthodox Christianity understands Christ as King. The suffering King, for whom the path to the resurrection led through the cross. And Jesus telling us, take up your cross and follow me. So today we've talked about two very different things. First, we talked about Thanksgiving. And really we have so much to be thankful for. Our lives are so much better than most of the people in the world. And our lives are so much better than most of the people in the United States. We have so much to be thankful for. We are among the fortunate. So we have reason to be thankful for our good lives. But we also saw today how Jesus told us that the path to victory leads through suffering. The true cost of following Jesus is not getting everything you want, having a wonderful life and tripping around with anything you want. But the cost of following Jesus is suffering. Because the world does not like those who follow Jesus. Unless you think that the Bible, when it speaks of the world, means bars in the back alley and gambling establishments and dancing and cards and sex and all that stuff. The world means just what it says. Everything out there. In the United States, as well as the countries we demonize. The world does not like those who follow Jesus. And so today we are thankful, and we are reminded that our task as Christians is to follow Jesus, not to follow society.